Hey everyone, Brendan Snyder here. How are you? Thanks so much for joining me and welcome to a discussion asking the question, can any one album actually be the best, right? So we see all of those top 10 lists and best album ever and all of those sort of things, but can any one album actually be the best? So I'm going to break this down here. I've got 6 points I want to make on this. I'm going to cover 9 different bands and 12 different albums doing this. And then you guys can weigh in and let me know your thoughts. Before we get started though, if you're new to my channel and you haven't already hit the subscribe button, please do. Also leave a comment, hit like, all those things do help support my channel. I'd greatly appreciate it. And of course, it's an added bonus. By turning on notifications, you're gonna stay up to date on everything going on in the world of music, just like this with a discussion on can any one album actually be the best? So this just goes back to me, growing up and seeing lists, whether done by, say, MTV, VH1, your favorite music magazine. Today, it has to do with channels like myself. Here on YouTube, I've done my own top 10 best albums ever. If you've watched that, you already know which one I think is the best. But, you know, all of that, there's so many things that go into it. So I'm going to break that down here. We've got 6 points to cover. I'm going to start off with talking about the era and the time frame in which an album was recorded. And I think that has a lot to do with the impact on an album, what goes into it, whether or not it's feeling a particular way or a style or that sort of stuff. So case in point, a lot of people would say Aerosmith's album Rocks from 1976 is a classic Aerosmith album, maybe even their best album ever. But you got people like me who came along a little bit later, and I would say Pump from 1989 is Aerosmith's best album. Now, these are two wildly different albums, both in style, but I think the thing that really sets them apart is the time frame and era. We got Aerosmith of the 70s and Aerosmith of the late 80s and early 90s. So at this point between these two, we've got 14, almost 15 years of time frame, of experiences, knowledge, musical change between what was going on in the 70s to the late 80s. I mean, we had straight up classic rock versus glam metal. This is really their glam metal era album. So can you really compare those two albums to one another and say that one is better than the other? Of course, I say yes, you certainly can if you want, but I do think that that is a subjective thing because so many different things come into it, even though we actually have the same 5 band members, a lot of the similarities and things between all of this, the style of writing and that sort, but even ranking amongst internally of a band, I think that can be very difficult to do when you really get down into the nuts and bolts of what make an album an album. And we're going to keep getting into that as we go further here. Next up, we've got different genres. So same way that I was pointing out that we've got the classic rock or 70s hard rock versus 80s, in this case, almost glam metal style. So we're really kind of comparing hard rock to glam metal there. 2 of the biggest albums ever, 2 of the biggest genre-defining albums. One is Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction, 1987. Whether you call this hard rock, glam metal, or what you call it, it's one of the biggest selling albums of all time and completely shifted the genre of music at the time to a harder direction based on this. And then just 4 short years later, we have Pearl Jam, who comes along with their album 10 in 1991 and does the exact same thing, completely shifting the landscape. So genre defining for the hard rock glam metal scene and genre defining in alternative rock, grunge, whatever you want to call that. But we got 2 major albums, and depending upon which genre you like more, you may be a fan like me who grew up in the 80s and says, Guns N' Roses definitely hands down is going to beat out Pearl Jam's 10. But if you came up a few years later and you're a little bit younger, you're probably saying Pearl Jam is the definitive album and beats out Guns N' Roses. So it really comes down to likes and dislikes at that point. Now, I'm lucky enough that I grew up right on the cusp, actually enjoy both the hard rock glam metal scene, but also the 90s alternative rock scene. And I love both. But I've got to be in different moods to listen to them. And I think that in and of itself says it all right there. Different genres are for different moods and styles and takes on music. And depending upon your mood, your interest, your style is going to determine what you think might be considered the best. But of course, again, a lot of that is subjective. Now we move on, we're still staying on this idea of style, but instead of on genre, I want to move deeper into the actual album itself and talk about albums that are hard, that are fast, versus ones that are maybe slower, softer, mellower, that sort of stuff. And whether we're talking about within the same style, and you're talking about, heavy metal, doing a rip-roaring, fast thrash metal, speed metal paced song, or you're talking about them doing some sort of a ballad or slower tune or something like that. But let's jump outside of that. Let's look at different genres, different time frames, and different styles or feel of album. And so first one I'm going to throw up here, Steely Dan 1972, their album, Can't Buy a Thrill. Love this album. It's my favorite Steely Dan album. But this comes out of what would later be deemed as, say, soft rock or yacht rock. It's not even a hard rock. And so this kind of music here is entirely night and day different to something like Judas Priest, Painkiller. I love both these albums. They're both my favorite albums by each of these bands. But I can't really compare the two albums to one another because they're night and day different. This is a slower, mellower album. It may have a few rock numbers, but it's a much slower, mellower album than this one here, Judas Priest, which is extremely fast and heavy, bordering a little bit on even thrash in what they're doing. But trying to compare these two styles of album, again, keeping it separate of genre. We know the genre is different, but the flow and pace of the albums are even different. And so there's things like that to take into account, whether an album is predominantly mellow or predominantly rock, whether there are peaks and valleys in the album, whether the album is a feel-good album or the album is introspective and dealing with how someone feels. Maybe the album is political and there's rage, in it. There could be any number of things within it. And we're not even really getting into the lyrical content. We're just talking about musically the content and how it feels. But certainly lyrics are a whole other thing because certain artists are going to sing about one thing. Talking about the glam metal era, you're talking about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. If you're talking about the 90s alternative rock, you're talking about emotions and depression and how someone was feeling and stuff like that. You get later in the 90s, you're certainly getting into politics. I mean, there's been politics and everything, but, Rage Against the Machine and those sort of bands versus even, Ted Nugent and his stuff. There's politics and everything. Megadeth when we're talking thrash metal. So certainly style and feel of an album can play a part in what we think or experience as what we might think is the best album, maybe a complete turnoff to someone else for another reason. Now, again, we're going to keep diving deeper within this. So I want to talk about who actually plays on the album. In pop, this is a very common thing where you'll have an artist who simply performs the songs. Somebody else writes them. They even may bring in multiple different producers to produce those albums. So really, how could you compare 10 different songs with 10 different writers with 10 different producers to one another on one album? Where is the artistry? What is it that you're actually comparing at that point? So I thought I would use as an example Meatloaf's Bat Out of Hell from 1977, another huge album, a genre-defining album, theatrical, bombastic rock, even prog rock, maybe, if you will, but a huge selling album nonetheless. And this album here is not written by Meatloaf, it's written by Jim Steinman. Now, Jim Steinman actually plays on this one here, although at later albums, he would have songs on it, but he wouldn't play on. But here we have two really separate, different people, one who writes, one who performs. So then we jump to Jim Steinman's Bad for Good, his solo album, where he writes, performs, sings, all of that. So this is all Jim Steinman, but this here, there's another performer, of course. Which one did better? The Meatloaf album. This one here, Sank Without a Trace. I don't think this album, the Jim Steinman, is any less good than this one over here. They're phenomenal. This was actually meant to be Bat Out of Hell 2, but Meatloaf had lost his voice at that point. The record label, not wanting to wait, simply had Jim Steinman go out and do it. But his name wasn't as big as Meatloaf's name across the top instead of the songs written by Jim Steinman aspect of it. And people didn't take to this one, right? But I think if you give these a real listen to one another, you'll see that they are just as good. So you can't always just compare it based on who's performing the material, because sometimes there's a lot of outside variables and things that come into it that are going to have an effect on how an album is interpreted, which leads into the next thing where I say each album is unique. It's like comparing apples and oranges. Apples and oranges taste different, they look different, everything about them is different. You peel an orange to eat it, you bite into the apple, you eat the skin. It's really night and day. How can you compare an apple or an orange? If you do, you're simply just saying, I like the taste of an apple better than I like the taste of the orange. But again, we're back to a subjective nature of that. And so for me, each album itself is really just a piece of art. It captures a time, it captures an event that's going on. And how do you reduplicate something like that, or say that this moment in time, this aspect, this artistry that was created at that particular moment is any less good or greater than something else? You have different performers on albums. You have different studios they were recorded in, different technology, like with the Aerosmith 1976 old tape reels and everything, and maybe even the 1989 album was still done the same way, but certainly later on getting into Pro Tools and things like that and digital recording. You have different engineers that are used on them that are going to record them differently, and different producers. You know, you take a Mutt Lange album versus a Jim Steinman album, they sound entirely different. And yet Def Leppard's Hysteria was going to be produced by Jim Steinman for a brief period of time before Mutt Lange returned. If you can imagine the difference of how that album would have sounded with one producer versus someone else. And then you've got the album art on these things. And with every album having a different piece of art on it, again, how can we compare the differences between that? And we have different record labels and different distributors, and a list just goes on and on about the differences in what goes into making an album. So beyond who writes the album, who performs on the album, we have all these other factors that play into it. And there's a lot of different things there that make one album different than the other. And where we finally end up is that opinions really are subjective. The whole process of all of this is very subjective. So when I say something is the best, it can't possibly be fact. There's no factual information to really attribute to, unless I broke down and I gave a point numbering system to something and I tried to attribute it that way, but then I'm still giving the points on it. So it's still not as factual as it could be. And so really, depending upon my mood, depending upon how I feel, depending upon the day of the week, I could actually choose different things. Oftentimes you see people do those, what 5 albums would you take to a desert island? If they're the last 5 albums that you're ever going to listen to in your life, what would those be? And if you ask me on a different day of the week, I'll probably tell you 5 different albums, just depending upon my mood and what I'm into. So in the end of the day, on all of this sort of stuff, I take it down to a couple groups that we always end up having warring factions over. And the first one being AC/DC. Highway to Hell, 1979, Bon Scott's last album, a big, huge, monumental album and defining album in and of itself. But the band returns with Brian Johnson for Back in Black in 1980, and this album, hugely genre-defining album. The band has 2 mega albums in their catalog, both produced by Mutt Lange, both on the same record label. All the other members are the same, yet these have 2 completely different feels to them because we've got Bon Scott and one particular time versus another time. So their singer has died. They're now trying to make a comeback. They're trying to prove themselves. They're also trying to pay tribute. Different experiences that were not going on during this album. So those experiences alone, how can we say that one set of experiences that led to this versus that are, say, better than another, right? So we're always going to have people. I grew up later. I say Back in Black is the better album. People who grew up with Bon Scott generally say this is the better album over Back in Black. But again, there's always going to be a subjective nature to something. And the last one being Van Halen, right? We've always got warring faction of whether it's Van Roth versus Van Hagar. And so I'm using just 1984's album, but it could have been the first album because both of those have gone on to sell over 10 million copies. But I love 1984, released in 1984, featuring, of course, David Lee Roth. I love this album, bought this one on cassette, may have even bought this one first, but then I bought 5150 from 1986 with Sammy Hagar. Now, I was growing up in the 80s, so to me, Sammy Hagar and the Sammy Hagar era albums will always be my favorite over these. But honestly, I feel like these are 2 different bands. We have a real party aspect style band going on here, capturing a time and a period coming up of youth. And then we've got a more introspective and love, singing about love and ballads and things like that. And yeah, there's still some of that party nature. But really, this is 2 different bands. They sound different going on between these things. And so how can we say one album is better than the other? There's so many different things about these. So all in all, there you go. Can any one album actually be the best? I don't know. I'm curious to see what you guys think. I will still always come down and say that I think, and just so you guys know, that I think the best album ever recorded is Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction. But I know that it's completely subjective. It's just my personal favorite, the album I go to more than anything else, the album that I've been listening to since 1987, and I have never tired of it. If this goes on, I will sing every lyric with it all the way through, and I don't want to turn it off. That's how I picked it as my best album ever. But I also know that it's just my opinion, yet we get into these warring factions with people about how could I say that that is a better album than, say, Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon? And Pink Floyd is my favorite band, not Guns N' Roses, right? So there's all these different things like that that play into it. In the end of the day, I think realistically, if we're all very truthful about it, we would admit and acknowledge that it's far too subjective to say one album is the best ever. But if we can simply acknowledge that whenever somebody says it, it is their own opinion, then yes, you can certainly pick your favorite album, the one that you think is the best album ever. And like I said, I'm going to go down, take it to my grave, Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction. So certainly let me know if you think that any one album can actually be the best. But regardless, just let me know, what is your favorite album ever? Let's pop those in the comments and talk about that along with the whole bigger, broader topic about whether any one album can be the best. All right, everyone, take care. Thanks for joining me. Have a great one, and I'll talk to you real soon. Bye-bye.